Over. I thought we had a technical glitch. So thanks, Natalie, for getting that working. And it's my extreme pleasure to tell you a little bit about the 369 series. And some of you that have joined us in the past will have heard this story. But for those of you that are new, we think it's really important for you to have at least some sense of the purpose of the 369 series. This is actually going to be our 7th speaker, so it's very exciting to have seen the interest and the momentum that built over the last year. And at each of the sessions, we are inviting someone to come and inspire us and speak to us and share stories of the important work that they are doing in their land, wherever that may be. The 369, you probably wonder, why is it called that? What does that mean? So the vocabulary of a 3-year-old is a very important predictor for the reading acquisition of a 6-year-old. And 6-year-old is often when we start in grade 1 to really tackle this really complicated thing, which is trying to crack this mysterious code that then we need to go on to use for the rest of our life. So the 3 represents the young 3-year-old. The 6 is the 6-year-old in that very important milestone age. And then when children are 9 years old, they transition away from learning how to read to reading to learn. So we decided to call it the 369 series to represent these important milestones in a child's language and literacy journey. But we also called it 369 because Nikola Tesla, who is an innovator and incredible, brilliant person, a mathematician, not a literacy person, he has some great research on the magic and the wonder of the number 369. So not only is it representative of these childhood milestones, but who wouldn't want to call a series after the magic wonder number of a brilliant person like Nikola Tesla? So that is why we call it the 369 series. And if you are here for the first time, we hope that you will keep coming back. And we have 2 more sessions lined up already for us to enjoy. They are always hosted on the 3rd Wednesday of each month. And the Wednesday, because it's the 3rd weekday, and we run it for 69 minutes so that we use that special 369 number again in everything we do. And we reveal each series 3 at a time. So today we are so lucky that Kathilee Porter is joining us from Ontario. And at the end of the session, I'll tell you about the next 2 speakers that we're going to have in October and November so that you can already get registered and mark your calendars. So without telling you any more about why we're here, let's get into why we're here. I am very lucky to be part of an incredible network of literacy practitioners that work and play all across Canada. And Kathilee is one of these amazing people that I was fortunate to meet through the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation. And I don't know, when you meet people and you just automatically connect and you have lots to talk about. We talked at conferences, we've talked at meetings. She came to Calgary as part of the contingent of literacy practitioners across the country who came to see what we were doing here locally. And we just couldn't get enough of each other. So we had to meet for coffee in Toronto. And I just love listening to what is happening with Ella. And Kathilee is going to tell you about Ella. And she is an integral part of the project that is going on there. And we're going to hear a lot more about it. But, you meet a lot of ex-teachers or librarians or, the usual suspects who enter into the literacy world. And I would say that Kathilee is anything but usual in our land because she's actually was a television producer. And it isn't very often when I go to a meeting and I meet a television producer. And in today's world, when we are all so dependent on video and Netflix and digital platforms, what a gift to the literacy collaborative that Kathilee is part of the leadership of. She has created all kinds of documentaries, and I'm very excited for her to be talking today about an initiative that's happening in their area called Cuddle Up and Read. And Kathilee, I don't know, there are, who wouldn't want to have the John Cleese Comedy Award on their resume? I'm not going to read all the awards, but that in particular is a pretty amazing award to have. And she has even been nominated for Juno in the past. So we are in for a delightful treat today to get to listen to Kathilee, and I feel very privileged to call her a friend and a fellow person who cares deeply about early learning and literacy. So Kathilee, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully I'll be able to live up to that. I'm going to start and share some slides so you can look at something else other than me. I am always a television producer. I'm not used to being the one that you look at. So I want to start to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here today and sharing some of our story. I'm going to wear two different hats in my story. Tell you that I'm located in Cambridge, Ontario, which is on the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. And I want to stop and acknowledge that fact. I also want to let you know that I have a big soft spot for Calgary and Alberta. My father lives in Calgary, as does my sister and her family. So I spend a great deal of time out there as well. So thanks for having me. As Stacey mentioned, I am the activator for the Early Literacy and Early Learning and Literacy Alliance of Waterloo Region. We just recently changed our name, so I'm still getting used to that. And I am also the head troublemaker for the Blend Media Group. That is a media company that I run with my husband. We are a blended family. And we started it about 15 years ago when I decided to leave the world of broadcast television and use my skills for good instead. So background in traditional media, I was a producer, director, writer. I've had a colorful and varied career from preschool television to the award-winning series for the John Cleese Comedy Award for a series on sexually transmitted diseases and game shows. So I've done a lot, mostly children's television, healthcare programming, and information-based programming. Those were my areas of interest. So I do a lot of work with elders and knowledge keepers from around the world. And one of the things they've taught me is that if you're going to share story or knowledge, you should always give people a sense of who you are and where you came from so that they can put the information you're giving them in perspective. So I want you to know that I was born in Ottawa to an RCMP officer and a homemaker. I was raised in Saskatchewan, and my mother was raised in a tiny town in northern Saskatchewan called Smeaton. This is my grandparents' store and cafe, the only store and cafe in this tiny town where most people were pretty poor. Most of the homes were tar paper shacks, and supplies were low in the store, and there was only one cow. That's going to become significant for you later in my story. So this is my grandmother, my Gram. She lived with us when I was growing up. She had terrible arthritis and was bedridden. And as a result, she loved books. She loved stories. She liked to tell them. She liked to hear them. And that's really where my love of story came from. And I now share that as a Gram to my granddaughter, much to my delight. And this is a picture of her when her mother speaks German. Her father is our middle son. He speaks English. And we bought her a series of books that were in German and English so that she could go back and forth. And this is the look of delight and the impact that books and literacy can have on young children. And I love this picture. So I worked by, with, and for kids, as I mentioned, with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, with experts from around the world, advocates, neuroscientists like Dr. Jean Clinton and Elder Tom Porter. And they've basically taught me two things that I really adhere to. One is the need to connect and blend what we are learning and what we know and try to de-silo information. And the second one is that media is not good for kids. right? I stopped letting my youngest child watch TV. And that's when I knew, because it wasn't good for the developing brain, that I shouldn't be making it for other people's kids. And so that's why I moved to work with the Early Literacy Alliance of Waterloo Region. That's our old name, about 5 years ago. It's an organization, and it's not an organization or a nonprofit, it's a network, an alliance. There are 12 member organizations that are active with us right now. In our region, there are 4 different library systems, both school boards, and a number of agencies and service organizations that participate in our group. And I'm going to take you on a little journey of some of the work that we have been doing and how we got where we are. Before I do that proverbial word we all hear right now, pivot, to talk a little bit about communications and how my 2 skill sets are coming together here. So the Alliance is about, originally started to ignite an early literacy movement in our region. We work to influence the influencers because our member agencies and organizations work directly with parents and families. So we don't do that. We don't compete with ourselves. We're at next level up. And we really want to kind of work on the early and often philosophy. So traditionally, when we started, we were doing a lot of community of practice work, a lot of project-based work, and we're slowly transitioning out of that. Because Waterloo Region, like many places in Canada, has a literacy problem that we are all working on, even though we have 2 universities and a college in our catchment area. So we started ELAR in 2009, and in 2014, we received a grant from a local funder, the Lyle S. Holman Foundation, to kind of do some strategic work, some planning, creating some resources and some messaging. So they created wonderful resources like this postcard around the Talk, Play, Read, Sing initiative, and some short videos. I'll show you just a clip of one.
Talk, play, read, sing. Play.
Yeah, how do we include him though? What are we gonna do with him? How's he gonna be involved?
All the babies must go in here.
That's a good idea.
So
protect them?
Yeah.
Okay, let's protect the babies. All right. And Mama T-Rex is protecting all the babies?
So then a few years later, we got a much larger grant for project-based work that they called Prescription for Literacy. This was before I joined, so I go back and forth between they and we. And as part of that grant money, we worked with a consultant firm over the first year, running what we called sprints, which is a Google idea. And basically they're week-long sessions where you map out a problem, you sketch it out, you come up with some potential solutions, you decide on one of them that you're going to prototype, you prototype it and you test it all in the course of a week. Uses a lot of sticky notes and a lot of time. And as I mentioned, we did that for over a year. And out of that, we also did things like forecasting work, where we brought multi-sectoral players from the region in to think about and project the future for kids. And we picked 2040 because we figured most kids who are kids now would be adults by that point in time. And what we were thinking about is, what might their world look like? What issues should we prepare for? And we often came up, of course, with technology, and that it was going to be at the forefront of our conversation, and helped us kind of dig deeper into what that might look like and explore some ideas that would inform our work. Because if we're going to change the world for kids, we should be thinking about what world we're trying to get them ready for. So some of the other things that came out of this sprint process with everyone, because there were many, but the big things for me were that it really built a sense of trust amongst the organizations and agencies that were around the table, because many of them traditionally actually compete with one another for dollars and eyeballs. And so we had to kind of learn to trust one another, really raise the profile of ELAR in the community. And it kind of really created this sense of wanting to convene, wanting to create circles where we invited people in and out. The circle got bigger and smaller, so that we had new voices and ideas coming to the table all the time. So that led us to run what we called generator events. And the idea was we would do these big, wide generator events where we would invite lots of people from the community and including unusual suspects, and then convening events where we take what we learned in that and apply it to a smaller, more focused meeting afterwards. So we held our first one in spring of 2018. We held it at a museum in town. We did some fun stuff, like they built resistor cases, DIY, so that you put your device in it so you could resist responding to it when you're at events, and interactive conversation starter stations around the museum. We had signs up all over the museum where the event was held with ideas that we wanted to test. And we asked people to use social media to post about the ones that really connected for them. So we had about 97 people attend, which at the time seemed like a really good turnout. We made a lot of unusual connections with healthcare and technology and business, other agencies within the community. And we ended with a keynote conversation about the art of conversation with an English professor, a child psychiatrist, and a hip hop artist. And it was really unscripted, really free flowing. We just wanted to see where the conversation went. And it went very quickly to technology and the impact of technology. And what we realized, it also got very divisive because of that. And so we decided as a group to step back from pursuing technology as something that we would want to talk about all the time. So we really sat with the feedback and response we got to the materials. It helped us inform what we were doing and the key concepts that we were going to work with from that point on. But one of the things we heard loud and clear is that when people hear the word literacy, they think Shakespeare, they think academia. And when they hear the words early literacy together, they think flashcards and e-readers, right? They weren't connecting the trajectory of early brain development, of the foundational elements of attachment and relationship and vocabulary and all these wonderful things. And so we thought our prescription for literacy project was misnamed and was kind of setting us up with the wrong narrative. So we went back to our funder. We got another packet of money. They're a wonderful funder. And we switched our prescription for literacy projects to our face-to-face project, which we were then started working on, with the idea, much like skin to skin for public health, something that was easy to convey, easy for people to remember, relatable and transferable for the various people that we would be interacting with in the face-to-face project. We stopped and did an environmental scan. One of the times I talked to Stacy to find out what was happening all over and who had done something like this, what worked and what didn't work. But we knew we still wanted to focus on the universal and key influencers of healthcare providers. But because of the work we had done with sprints, which includes empathy mapping, we really thought about what it would mean for healthcare providers. How could we integrate what we were doing into their workflow, make their job easier, not harder, make it customizable so we could go to lots of different providers, make it consistent, even though it was customizable. Also, most importantly for me, make it sustainable so that we weren't in 2 years finding the project was not able to keep going. Then we sat down with some of the people that we had collected during all those sprints and generator events and mapped out a circle of care in our community. Where were new families and their parents and children interacting with the healthcare system and with those that surround the healthcare system in the community? Where was the consistent messaging and language that we could take advantage of? And so we have the Well Baby visits here in Ontario. I'm pretty sure you have this similar thing, if not exactly the same thing in Alberta. We decided that that's what we would use as our touch points to go into the healthcare system, is the Well Baby visit schedule. And we designed material based on that idea. We stopped to think about the idea that parents, when they go in to see a healthcare provider, if you're coming in because your baby has croup or because they won't eat or because you're exhausted from lack of sleep, this may not be the moment to speak to you about literacy, right? So how do we pay attention to a parent's need to know and what they're ready to hear, but also the healthcare provider? How much time and capacity do they have for what we're asking them to do? Because this really was for us an intersection of a whole bunch of streams, parents and their caregivers and their children, the healthcare system, but also those who were providing services and programs in our area, and also the places and spaces that parents and their young children tend to go. So we decided to launch a pilot project for face-to-face in Cambridge. Cambridge is one of the municipalities within our region, and it is probably our higher needs community as a whole. So that's one of the reasons why we chose it. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. That's a big thing for us. And so we took those resources that we had developed before. We took feedback from the healthcare providers. We added a name tag and a URL to it so they could put posters up in their clinics and allow families to just scan the information. We added the whys that we heard from the generator event. Don't just tell us about the what and how, tell us why we should do things. We added those to the postcards. We diversified the images. And then we created some new things. We did kits because some of our healthcare providers, like midwives, were mobile and they wanted to be able to bring it with them. Others wanted kind of a prescription pad where they could check something off and hand it out. This was a pilot. We could try anything. We listened to what they asked for. And we looked for ways to connect to existing things that were out there. So public health has a newborn baby kit in the hospitals. We put our messaging into that kit on the magnets that they were using. We integrated it into things like the Sleep and Your New Baby program as well, so that parents early and often continually hearing this messaging about face-to-face. Our local hospital in Cambridge was running a pilot of an app that was being run. So we integrated our messaging into the maternal child section of that app as well. We really wanted to be responsive to the healthcare partners that were in the pilot with us. So we would listen to them, try something, ask them about it, listen, learn, revise it, apply the knowledge and repeat. So there was a lot of back and forth. Let's try this, let's try that, see what worked and what didn't work. Healthcare providers fairly quickly, the primary care docs in particular, asked us to create a website so that then when they're in a room with a client, they could go quickly to find information. And after we had created it originally just for healthcare providers, then we had people ask us, can you mirror it for parents and caregivers so that we can send them to the site as well to see the same information that they're hearing when they're in the doctor's office. So basically the website is like this at the 6-month visit, because it's with that well baby schedule, our 3 key messages, no more than 3, that's a communications rule, and resources. But healthcare providers asked us that they were comfortable with flagging system. Red flags in particular is what they asked for first. What are the things that we have to look for to say that there's a problem? We subsequently have developed this further so that there are now yellow flags and green flags to it as well. We had a long laundry list of all the wonderful services and programs in our community that the healthcare providers could refer families to. And they, to a person, said to us, don't give us a laundry list. We want a gatekeeper, make it simple. So these 3 resource places are directly connected to the flags. Red flag, send them to early on because there's more support there. Yellow flag, Family Compass, because they have some autonomy for what resources they need. And public libraries are for green flags, people who are already reading and on the path to literacy. We had an administrator in one of the healthcare clinics that I was going in and out of a meeting, say to us, you know, we can't have toys in our waiting room anymore. Would you guys consider putting a little lending library in the waiting room for us with messaging? Huge success, very organic. We tried it in 2 places and we're now figuring out with the library's help how to roll it out into other waiting areas across the community. And our tech people that we had met at the generator said, hey, let's do a Hacking Health Waterloo around literacy. So then we got to play with a bunch of young, very energetic tech people coming up with new ideas of things that we could do. So just constantly searching for how we could find innovation. But a big part of our work has always been about how do we change culture? How do we embed this work in systems so that it is sustainable, so that we don't need to keep pumping money in it and creating postcards and posters and providing books, etc. And so one of our ideas with healthcare in particular was around the electronic medical record system, right? So every patient that comes in, information goes into the EMR. Healthcare providers find a ton of information and resources within that system, but it's different in almost every clinic and every place that you go. So originally very clunky, was not working for us at all until we'd stumbled across this organization, Cognizant MD, which basically has an engagement platform. It's usually in waiting rooms, but you can also do it from home for a parent and caregiver. And so we've been integrating and developing a form around early literacy and brain development that will now feed into the healthcare provider. So as part of face-to-face, I was going out, I was doing a ton of grand rounds and lunch and learns and meetings where I'd come in and talk about the project and the resources that were there. And one of the things we found, and it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but it was, that not a lot of healthcare providers were aware of the significance of early literacy and or its connection to brain development and why it should matter to them. So I was spending a lot of time at these meetings talking to them about brain development, about sensitive periods of development, how skill begets skill from bottom up, simple to complex. They were not aware of this kind of knowledge, and they were definitely not aware of scaffolding and the trajectory of development and its connection to literacy development. So we decided at that point to reach out to Alberta, to the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative that I was aware of in their brain story work. And we asked Dr. Nicole Sharon to come down and do a session with our ELAR members and our healthcare pilots and just a couple of leaders from our community about the brain story and the brain story certification program that is out there. That event went from a 2-hour event to a 3-day event. It's, as people heard about it, we included mental health people, addictions people across the lifespan, different sectors and government agencies and service providers all got involved in learning about the brain story. And most of that work is still very active today. So in the midst of all this success, we were having some issues because here in our region, the healthcare system was being revamped. The funding model was changing. The CoHealth app folded. Our public health was under serious budget cuts. We were under the process of amalgamation, and we were having issues moving the project forward because everyone was in such a state of disarray. So we had paused things. We were doing a lot more live events as we waited to see how things would settle with all these changes in the systems. And then the pandemic hit right in the middle of that. So all of those live events, because of my media background, quickly became virtual events for us. And when we switched them to virtual events, we noticed that we could do things like mirroring. So when we had Ann Douglas come to talk to professionals about how to support parents, then we could have her also talk to parents right afterwards, and the same with Jean Clinton. And we also got much higher numbers. We were reaching much more people, getting much more engagement with it. We started creating a video series as we noticed the pandemic dragging beyond the initial 2 weeks that was called We Got This. And it was really about kind of keeping the community together, talking about how we could deal with the stresses and issues that were coming up early on in the pandemic. And we had been planning to do another brain story event after the fall one, where we did continuing medical education with our healthcare providers and some very specific work. That, of course, had to switch. We made it virtual. The numbers went from the fall, which was 200 people, to 1,200 people attending. It turned into a summer learning series with the brain story certification, connected us to a national program with the Brain Builders Lab. And then we started a brain story mobilization group, which includes school boards and service providers and government people and so forth in the region because of this virtual connection. So at this point, we realized the pandemic is now going on. It's going to be with us for a long time, and trying to work with and message with healthcare providers was probably not the best idea. So we knew we had to pivot. We still wanted to influence the influencers. So we selected a new influencer who could use help during this time. And of course, it was the education section, because schools in Ontario closed down in the spring. They didn't know what was going to be happening in the fall. And teachers, particularly early years teachers and ECEs, were having a really hard time. And because we were a community partner, we were able to set up sessions and webinars over the summer, which the school boards couldn't do themselves because teachers aren't supposed to be going to professional development over the summer, where we could talk about SEL, we could talk about brain development, we could help them figure out ways to support one another and build that connection. So those webinars happened all summer. They kept going for the subsequent year as we went in and out of school and dealt with things around the pandemic. And then last late winter, early spring, we held another one of these webinars with Dr. Martha Welch, who is with the Columbia Nurture Science Center. And she does work around the autonomic nervous system and its connection to attachment and regulation between mothers and their newborns in particular. And that event kind of sparked the Cuddle Up and Read initiative that Stacy was talking about, which was to address the fact that we were coming out of another school year where things had been disrupted. Kids were once again going home for the summer, not knowing what was going to happen the following year. There was a lot of talk about COVID slide and literacy loss and the learning gap, and parents and teachers were understandably anxious and upset. So teachers wanted something they could say to parents and caregivers before they left for the summer about what they could do to help their children over the summer. And parents and caregivers, of course, were looking for that as well. So we worked for the rest of the school year in creating resources for teachers that they could use to send home on their social media or in materials and resources. And then we built a bank of things that we put on a Google Drive and made it open source so anyone could go in and get it and use it to encourage caregivers to read with their children over the summer, because the benefits go both ways when you do that. We also created some videos. I want to show you the whole thing, but it's too long, so I'll just show you a little bit so you get a taste of what they were like.
Scientists have discovered that reading to a preschooler helps their brains work faster and better. Cuddling up to read with your child builds their vocabulary, empathy, and imagination.
But Mama made him better and kissed him and hugged him, and look at him now. He's eating sandwich, Honafi sandwich, Honafi cake.
He's happy.
Yeah, Mama's happy and the baby is, yeah. What does he have in his mouth?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mama thought piece of cake. Wow, ututi.
So delightful as it is, I will move on. But one of the reasons for that one in particular was introducing the idea that it didn't matter which language you did it in. Matter of fact, for Cuddle Up and Read, reading in your first language, usually the language of your emotion, is one of the best ways to do it. And we heard from a lot of different organizations and group about how much they loved that message. So during this time, we also did some work on Ella. Like I said, ELAR used to be our name. People often mispronounced our acronym, and we had that whole issue with literacy. So we changed our name recently to the Early Learning and Literacy Alliance. So the short form being Ella, much easier to say. Also happens to be my grandmother's name. So it's a nice benefit for me. And we're working towards an event this fall called our newest generator event. It's also still going to be virtual, called Human Connection. It's a 2-day event, 6 sessions, 2 hours per session, where Dr. Clinton has a conversation with some pretty big leaders in areas connected to brain development, child development, and early literacy, like Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Adele Diamond and others, coming up October 28th, 29th. And I will send information to Stacy. So anybody who wants to join us, it's free. And you can just register and come. So Ella, like I said, wants to ignite an early literacy movement, but we really want to change attitude and culture. We want to embed the work that we're doing into the systems, harness our members' services and programs, but really make the kind of change that becomes so natural that it doesn't need our support anymore. So now I'm going to do my pivot. I'm going to put my other hat on as the Blend Media Group and talk to you a little bit about communications and how that relates. A lot of the information that I am going to be speaking to you about comes from these people who have inspired me or taught me. And I will also share this information with Stacy afterwards if you want to find out about anything that I'm talking about, because I draw a lot from all of those groups. So for me, communication is not just about sharing knowledge or facts. If it was, we would all eat properly and exercise and live within our means, right? Simply raising awareness is not enough. It needs to change the way people think, feel, and act. Corporations are really good at this. That's why I got so many shoes in the other room, right? The science of neuroplasticity has shown us that the brain can change throughout the lifespan. We can change behavior, and communication is one of the ways that we do this. But here's one of our big issues right now. We are wired to scan for the negative, right? We have gotten so good at it that sometimes that's all we see, right? Our brain gets so efficient at finding it. And it's having a profound impact on communication, on behavior, on our social fabric right now. And technology is making it even more pronounced. Algorithms are built to use negativity and fear to get our attention. And a steady diet of dire news and news feeds that trigger our anxiety, our fight or flight response, our sense that the world is out of control. Technology has harnessed this knowledge to impact human behavior and our brains in ways that we are only beginning to understand. And it's changing the way we think, feel, and act. So I think it's high time that social movements also start taking advantage of this knowledge, the science, the technology, and the understanding, using it for social good. So I want to share a bit of some of this newer knowledge that we're now learning. I'm a media person. This is all new to me, right? About progressive communications to help you understand how to frame the work you're doing in a way that might have a better chance of changing behavior. Because if we want to make the case for our issues, we can't rely on fear and negativity. We need to promise a brighter future. Because in a time of great fear and negativity, we are all hungry for hope and optimism. But for those of us who work with social issues dedicated to exposing inequities and problems, positive communication does not come naturally, right? But research points to the fact that fear and pessimism trigger undesirable, conservative, and suspicious views, while hope and optimism tend to inspire more liberal views. So hope is a pragmatic strategy, right? It's informed by history, by communication experts, organizers, neuroscience, cognitive linguists. It can be applied to any strategy or campaign or story that you're using. Because stories are the #1 brain changer on the planet. Neuroscientists believe that our brains are hardwired for stories. They captivate our brains. So if you ground your messaging, your story, in the values you stand for, in the vision of the world you want to see, your message can set the agenda rather than just reacting to the other side, which is often what happens. So talk solutions, not problems. When we focus on the problem, we actually reinforce it in the mind of our audience. A world in crisis pushes people into the hands of those who offer them security and a return to some imagined idealized past. So stop saying no to the problem and give our governments, our policymakers, your audience something to say yes to. Shine a light on an alternate possibility, right? It doesn't have to be huge. Matter of fact, it's better if it's attainable. Focus on a 6-month change. How would it work? In what way would it make things better? Where else has it already worked? Highlight what you stand for, not what you oppose. Look for frames that unite us, not those that keep us apart. If you don't make the case for the world you want to see, who's going to do it, right? And that's what your communication can do for you. But pay attention. The language of conflict is divisive, right? Protection from harm is an implicit message based on fear and self-interest versus something like do the right thing, right? That's about an opportunity to act on the human desire to be a good person and help other people, right? Simple language will often go to protection from harm, but the affirmative is always better because it's such powerful stuff, right? Love is love, make America great again, right? Written words, video, images, they all communicate value, right? The story that will change the way people think, feel, and act. Fear and pessimism get clicks, but they don't change behavior or thoughts. If you emphasize support for heroes, not pity for victims, you get to humanize people, right? So think about how you're going to frame your campaigns, right? As a narrative of hope or fear, threat or opportunity. Because we're all being influenced by the same world events, the same shared experience and humanity for good and bad, right? Beware of how it influences your audience. Pay attention to zeitgeist. When the world is feeling like it is spinning out of control, messaging around unrelenting, accelerating change may not be the best, right? So put it in that context for people. We can't just tell stories that are all no and don't and can't, though many do. People need to recall, what happens is people recall the assertion, but they don't remember whether it was true or false when you use negatives in your campaign. For examples, immigrants are not terrorists. This was an actual campaign that happened in the US, right? But here's the problem. All people remember is something about immigrants and something about terrorists, right? Little tiny words aren't imageable. So they're not nouns. Don't and can't do not hold up against words like terror in our memories or then the impact that they have on our behavior. Negation also fails because of the backfire effect. The backfire effect is that people are much, much more combative with information that directly negates a belief that they have. And they'll actually double down on that previous belief if it's directly contradicted. So social movements often create narratives that react and respond to the other side rather than giving people a believable, achievable alternative, right? Communicators often tells other people's stories rather than their own. Who is this ad for, right? Be careful you're not telling your opposition's story in trying to respond to their accusations. What story are you telling? What values are you connecting with? Whom are you speaking to? And what values do they hold? Deliver your story of solutions. And you first need to do the work to understand your public's prevailing views and assumptions, because how a message is understood depends on the person's underlying beliefs, the stories they were told that formed their beliefs, because beliefs shape the way they interpret the information they receive. So we all have these big, common, largely unexamined ideas of how we view or understand the world. It's what your parents taught you, what you've seen in the media, what you were taught in school, the books you read, your friends, the culture you grew up in. So good communication starts by trying to capture the untranslated story. That's the key ideas that members of the field want those not working in the field to understand or support. Once you have your key idea identified, then you can begin comparing that with the way the public currently thinks about that issue, right? So you do interviews, you do surveys, you read letters to the editor, you follow social media, even those accounts that drive you crazy, to find out how people are thinking. You watch and listen to members of the public or your audience and identify the gaps that must be bridged for the public to have a fuller understanding of the issue so they can see and hear your untranslated story. Because no matter how great your campaign is, if you haven't thought about what their bias is, they're not going to hear or understand what you're saying to them. Culture, the common implicit assumptions and patterns of thinking that underlie how people make sense of the world around them, is so important in communications. Because we have two basically cultural models that people point to around this, right? The individualistic strain, which assigns a central role to individual choice and willpower, or what's called the ecological strain, which sees the issue, at least in part, as a product of social and environmental influences. And of course, the individualistic strain is much more dominant in North American public thinking than the ecological one. But the reality is, as my friend Kika Ojo says, culture eats policy and strategy for breakfast. So you have to pay attention, understand what cultural models are most productive, which are barriers, and which are likely to obscure people's understanding is a really important step in developing effective ways of framing an issue. You need to determine where your audience stands on the issue right now and where they are most open to change so that you can find your opportunities to persuade them. Think about your audience on a scale of kind of 1 to 5. Your 5s are opposed to you. They don't believe in what you're selling, right? The number 1s, they're with you. You don't have to sell them. They already agree with you, right? In between, the 2s and 3s, those are your persuadables, right? If you engage your base, if you motivate them to action, they will help you transform your persuadables. And eventually, they're going to hit those number 5s, your opposition as well. If we want to lead people step by step to reach our conclusion that the early years matter, that relationship and love builds brains, that reading rewires the brain, which can only happen if foundational blocks are put in place, we need to start by knowing where they are and what they believe. Research shows that audiences are more receptive to unfamiliar arguments when they're framed by universal values that we all care about. So start with shared values, and you need to know what they are. Pay attention to episodic stories. That's the way the media likes to tell stories, the individual hero narrative that actually works against us in social movements. You want to tell thematic stories. That's what Frameworks Institute calls them. Give people the broader context. Help them see that it's a systemic problem and there are systemic solutions, not an individual problem, which means you kind of want to widen your lens, right? Frame the situation and think about how the problem was created in the first place. So structure your messages along these lines. Lead with your value and vision, introduce the problem, frame the problem as a threat to that value that you've got people to agree to, and then give them a couple of facts and jump quickly to a solution that seems possible to your audience. So framing is the choices we make in what we say and how we say it. It's how and what we explain, what we leave unsaid, what we emphasize. And these choices matter. They affect what your audience understands, how people hear us, and how they act. A frame is a guide. It directs people where you want them to look. And more importantly, it helps them interpret what they see. Every communication is framed. Frames affect whether we think an issue is important, whether we think of it as a private personal problem or a shared social concern, and the kinds of solutions we support. So framing is about making choices about what we say and how we say it. Using the wrong frame means we risk our message backfires or being ignored. Using the right frame unlocks new ways of thinking. So build a message with an identified audience and your frame, right? Connect the dots for them. Start with your value, explain the issue, give them an explanation. Don't just provide them with a solution. And then offer a sequence of ideas that takes you to the solution. We really recommend using metaphors. That's why you see a lot of it in the Harvard work. It's sticky. It helps inoculate you against unproductive patterns of thinking. It nudges thinking in directions called channeling, and it helps clarify things for people. So if you can use a metaphor, use a metaphor. So for me, really understanding that communication is frame dependent, that your audience doesn't know what you know. Make sure that at the end of your message, they do know what you need them to know. Facts matter only when connected to value. You can't correct misunderstanding. If you let people get a misunderstanding, you're going to have trouble turning that around. We've all seen that. And crisis messaging causes crisis fatigue. So when you're in a crisis, try not to revert to that as a way to raise money because it's going to work against you. So there's a lot of really great resources out there right now. Australia has done some really great work with frameworks. I would highly recommend, and I'll provide the link, looking at some of the things like this quick start guide that they have on telling your stories. And we're doing some work with Waterloo and Smart Waterloo region that I can also share with you. So I'm almost out of time, but I want to get to my end story because I started you with this image. This is once again my grandparents' store in Smeaton, Saskatchewan. And that one store in town owned by my grandparents, there was also one cow in town owned by the Hawkinsons. And the Hawkinsons made butter that they brought to my grandparents' store. The problem was, maybe due to what they fed the cow, maybe the way where it lived or how they treated it, the Hawkinsons' butter was awful, right? But for everyone in town, when they referenced Hawkinson's butter, what they were meaning was, it's better than nothing, because without it, it was the only butter that they had, right? It represented for people resilience, fortitude, having a positive attitude. So my mother grew up with that phrase. She taught it to myself and my siblings. We taught it to our children. And recently, my 5-year-old granddaughter that you saw earlier, took a bite of a cookie that my youngest daughter had made where she mistakenly used salt instead of sugar. And my granddaughter made a face and said, "Ew, Hawkinson's butter," right? She never knew her great-great-grandparents. It's from a place she'll never see, a cow she never met, a butter she'll never taste. The power of story, the power of words. Never, never underestimate how much impact they will have. That's it. Thank you for listening. I hope it was informative.
I just want to hear it all again. I feel like I couldn't listen or write fast enough. So I'm very happy that we recorded this session, and everybody who also wants to have a rewind and a replay, you know that you can go to the Calgary Reads website and the session will be there for you to get wiser and to get inspired to eat more butter, right? I'm trying to, Jacqueline, did you happen, I saw a question come into the chat, and if anyone else would like to ask question either through the chat or through unmuting yourself, we do have a few minutes for some questions.
Yeah, there was one question in the chat from Margot Smith, saying it's great info, and she's wondering, as the solution is relationship-based, one-on-one attachment, reading, cuddling, etc., between caregiver and child, how do we frame it so people don't dismiss it as someone else's problem, like I read to my kids, etc.?
Yeah, it's something we talked a lot about with the Cuddle Up and Read initiative. And so it was about how can we as a community provide the resources and supports so that parents and caregivers, adults and children have the space, the resources, the time to do it, and recognizing that that was enough, you know, especially as we were worried about the literacy loss and COVID slide, or they were worried about literacy loss and COVID slide. It was kind of that response to this is something you can do. I would say that Cuddle Up and Read is not a systemic message. It was a very much response to a crisis message. And we are now just in the process with the generator event coming up, trying to figure out how that we round it out to be a greater long-term message for people. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. I also have a question, just in terms of, you were talking about, I love the framing of the communication. And I'm just wondering, I think one of your slides was ahead, and it's, you know, if your head's full of fears, there's no room for dreams. And I'm wondering, like right now, I feel there's so much weighing on people's minds. And so like, where are you at in terms of framing literacy as something people really need to care about?
Right. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we did, part of there's lots of collaboratives in Waterloo. I think it's because there's so many communities here. So we also have a collaborative called Wellbeing Waterloo Region. And we ran a campaign starting kind of in the fall after the pandemic started, called the Finding Hope movement. And it was all about how do we actively find hope? Where do we find it? How do we share it with other people? How do we encourage it with people? And it became kind of a social media phenomena down here, where people would write messages on their sidewalk. We did window clings and a few different things that we could do limited during that time. But people really got into it, and businesses were putting signs up on about where they were finding hope and how they were finding hope. And that active looking for something created that sense of positivity that we were looking for. So I think sometimes it's about that. It's encouraging people to change their focus, to think about the fact that just cuddling up and read, not only does it help your child, it actually makes you feel better, because the autonomic nervous system goes both ways. So in cuddling with them and having that physical relationship and enjoying the reading and the story with them and being present with the book, there's so much more going on. So we have a series coming up with Dr. Clinton as well. She does she's a big advocate for us, where we filmed we used the footage of parents and adults and children reading, and we had Jean watch the footage and go, there, right there, that's the moment. See how important that is? This is what happened in that moment, and this is why it's so important to do. And so teachers are going to start rolling those out at the end of this month, actually.
I definitely appreciate your message of hope. I don't know about others, but it's definitely something that I need to be reminded of. I think it's easy to get into that negative vortex. And yeah, just the hope and how we can, I guess, center our messaging on hope and solutions. I really appreciated that reflection as well. I think
now I know why I like you so much, Kathilee. My favorite word, my youngest daughter's middle name, and it was the subject of my thesis. So
wow.
I did not know that you had this Finding Hope campaign, and pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, and it's funny, you know, we did a podcast, and Anat Shanker, who I referenced in my sources, she talks about the fact that, you know, so many times, especially with social movements, we say, here's the Titanic, want to buy a ticket, right? It's what we do, right? And she's like, we have to turn it around to, you know, there's another way. There were other ways to get across the ocean at the time. We're not going to build another Titanic, because we learned, like, how do we turn the message to the positive, not the negative? Because nobody wants to join a sinking ship, right?
Yeah, for sure. Anyone else have a question? I don't see anything in the chat. Again, feel free to, Azmina, it looks like you've unmuted yourself. You must have a question.
I do. Hi, everyone. I'm Azmina from Frontier College. The question, I'm a parent of a 5-year-old, and I found that when the pandemic hit, I was tempted to give her screens because I was trying to manage working from home and caring for her. And I had this, you know, thing in the back of my head saying, this is so wrong. She doesn't need a screen. And yet I had to do it. I didn't really have a choice. And since then, there's been a ton of TED Talks. I read articles all the time about the myths about, you know, why screen time isn't so bad as long as it meets criteria A, B, and C, and things like that. And they do make me feel better, I'll be honest, because it kind of justifies my desperation to give my daughter screen time when I'm trying to work. What do you have to say about that? You know, are we there yet where we can say, as long as it's got criteria 1, 2, 3, you know, technology isn't so bad? I mean, I know the age of the child really matters. What are your thoughts, Kathilee?
Well, it's interesting. I would say, come to the generator. One of our speakers wanted it to be Marianne Wolf, but she was unavailable. So she recommended one of her mentors, Dr. Naomi Barron. This is her field of research. And part of, if you read any of Marianne's books as well, a lot of the people I'm talking to right now say, screen time is developing different parts of the brain. That's kind of one of the things, right? It's why people are better at multitasking. They're better at kind of moving quickly from one thing to the next and holding multiple things in the brain at the same time, but it's not triggering the deeper learning and the complex thought and memory. So there are benefits to both. And so what a lot of us are advocating for now is being intentional about both. You can't just give them screen time because it is not developing parts of their brain that we know is good for them. It's like the whole argument that Stuart Shanker made when people tried to get rid of handwriting in school, cursive in school. And he was like, it is so good for self-regulation. The act of cursive writing requires the brain to focus, to move slowly, to be intentional, right? So you don't throw out cursive because you have computers. We need to understand what it does in our brain and how we can be intentional. How amazing would it be if our kids could activate what Marianne calls a biliterate brain, right? That's good with technology, and that is also good with written text.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathilee. That was a great response to a very big and vast question that I think we're all asking ourselves and those around us. I think we're going to, I don't see anybody else unmuted. So I just want to say thank you so much. This is the wonder of technology, that Kathilee is not in Calgary. If we had been sitting in the same room, we would have not have been able to learn what we did this afternoon. And the 369 series, being all done digitally over the past while, is allowing us to bring in different speakers from different places. And I feel like this series is the nationals let's say, because for the first 369, we had all local people from the network. For the most part, our Lena session was a blend of Calgary and Denver when we were talking. But as you heard, Kathilee is in Ontario. Our next speaker, Nina from the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation, she too is in Ontario. And she is coming next month to speak to us about the Read On Canada initiative that many of us were involved in, which was getting a lot of books out to children during the summer through our local food banks. And she's going to speak to that. But also the bigger context around how can we ensure equitable access to early literacy and the reading relationships and the reading resources that all children deserve to have. And then in November, our third speaker of the series, Greg, is the newest executive director of the Little Free Library movement. And certainly in Calgary, we have, Calgary Reads put 80 Little Free Libraries into our community 5 years ago. There's now over 400 Little Free Libraries in our city. And he's going to come and talk to us from Little Free Library in the United States, and how, again, we really need to work hard to expand access to books for all children. And we're very excited. Greg replaced Todd Bowles, and Todd was the guy who first built the very first library, and his mom passed away, and he built it and dreamed of this thing to honor his mom, who was a voracious reader. And from that one little book box, this massive international movement has exploded. And I don't think there's probably a town or city where there wouldn't be at least one Little Free Library or book lending shelf or something within the spirit of that. Sadly, Todd Bowles passed away a few years ago. And Greg is now leading this, again, incredible movement and we're looking forward to having him too. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll hope to see you back again in October. Thanks, Kathilee.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.